Thanks to NACDL. Thanks to everyone who's here and for your work in defending the Constitution and the rule of law. And I don't need to tell you all, it's more important now than ever. And so grateful to have this time with you. Also grateful for the years of partnership with NACDL, especially when I was at FAM. We worked together on a lot of important issues. At the beginning of my professional career, when I first came to Washington, D.C., I was a tough on crime congressional staffer. I worked for Republicans in the House and the Senate and saw these issues from a different perspective. And throughout my life and through personal experiences and others have had a change in thinking on this, but I still retain some of the values and perspective that had me there in the first place. And so this topic is really important to me because I do believe it's going to take both sides to make criminal justice reform happen. That's how, as Kyle said, it's happened in the past. And I think sometimes bipartisanship can get a bad name. The goal is not mushy moderation, but it is to get durable and lasting change. And I think unless you're in a supermajority blue state or supermajority red state, the only way to get durable change is to have bipartisan buy-in. And I dare say that many of us who you're going to meet today worked on the First Step Act, which was sort of the culmination and the glory days of bipartisan criminal justice reform. And had that law been signed in its earlier iteration by President Barack Obama, I think we might be looking at repeal of some or part of that law, but it had the benefit of being passed by a Republican Senate and signed by President Trump. And so any sort of attacks on that have been pushed back in a bipartisan way. And so I think there's really a good argument for bipartisanship as a way of getting change. Also, you do not want a pendulum swing of reforms passing over the objections of law enforcement, victims, others, and then having a change in time and then a backlash because of a rising crime. And then you see the pendulum swing the other way. And despite the best efforts of reformers, there's nothing you can do to stop the backlash. And so the goal is to try to make good policy, evidence-based policy based on data and evidence, not emotion and politics, and to keep that policy, for as long as we can. And so Kyle has assembled an excellent group of panelists that I am lucky to sort of host. And I'm happy to say I've worked with all of these folks. And instead of me doing a sort of bad introduction, I know you have their full bios, but I think it'd be helpful so you get a sense to hear what sort of brings folks to the issue. And I'll ask you guys to be brief, but just sort of what's your perspective? How do you come to these issues? Sort of what informs your values that bring you to these issues? And then just, are you optimistic in this time? Are you pessimistic? And then we're going to drill in on that. But sort of what's your general take on where we are in this moment? And I'm going to start with Mark Levin, only because Mark is one of the most optimistic people. And so I want to start with somebody who's optimistic.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I hope I don't disappoint. I have to say, I know you referenced tough on crime, and I think we all agree here. Probably the best way to be tough on crime is to, number one, prevent it from happening to begin with, and number two, as you've worked on recently, solve more crimes so you can get, particularly the serious crimes, shootings, get the perpetrators off the street so you don't have more of them. But I think that there is a lot of reason for optimism. You look at what's going on around different states. The Georgia Survivor Justice Act, for example, passed virtually unanimously earlier this year, signed by a conservative governor, allows cases to be reopened where there was abuse, trauma, human trafficking, domestic violence, and various other states. Of course, you're working on the Pennsylvania policy to give grants to improve clearance rates. Arizona ended the crack pattern disparity and also passed independent oversight for their prison system. And there's many others as well. I think that we've seen a difference, though, in terms of the front end versus the back end. So, for example, at the Bureau of Prisons, of course, the shutdown is a real really interfering with these efforts. But nonetheless, Billy Marshall and Josh Smith, they've really doubled down on the First Step Act, on expanding programming and getting more people transitioned to reentry centers. And that sends a positive signal to states across the country, I think, as well. Obviously, we all know on the front end, bail, not too many people talk about progressive prosecutors anymore, but that was certainly a tripwire. But I think the when you get down to it, the reason to be optimistic is nobody wants more crime. We all share the same values in terms of getting more people into the workforce, keeping families together, whether you're on the left or the right. And so I truly think that this isn't a matter of one side giving into the other, but each side can vindicate their values through sensible criminal justice reform.
You lived up to your reputation beautifully right there. That was exactly the great opening there. And Brianna, I want to invite you in to talk about sort of what brings you to these issues and your take of this current moment.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin, and great to be with this panel and be speaking to all of you. As Kevin mentioned, Brianna Newfer, I am the Chief Operating Officer at a newly formed organization called Americans for Public Safety. But before I get into that, to back up a little bit, I think what brings me to these issues, I've always had a strong bent towards justice and also defending those who can't speak up for themselves. And so those have been two personal values that have really motivated my work. About 10 years ago, my family, immediate family member of mine, was falsely accused and wrongfully convicted. So I found myself really thrust into this unrequested front row seat of all of the failures in our justice system. And at that point, it really kicked off a years-long professional journey for me to better understand why are things the way they are, what are the policy levers that can be changed to drive improvement, and who are the key stakeholders that need to be at the table to make this change happen. And all of this has really led to the recent formation of my organization, Americans for Public Safety, and a large part in due to that last piece that I mentioned, the stakeholders, right? Who are we making sure their voices are a key part of this conversation? And I think for any kind of public safety, criminal justice legislation to be effective and to be durable, it absolutely has to have strong input from law enforcement. It has to have strong input from victims and survivors organizations, as well as the American public at large. And so the reason why I'm optimistic in this time is that you do see society, really the American public, demanding change, demanding a response to violent crime, demanding public safety policies that work. And I think the key is for those of us on the call and those of us listening in to get in front of lawmakers with the right policies, the ones that are proven and effective solutions that are not just going to give lip service to this issue or just be reactionary, but are really going to meet the public where they're at with demand for change and demand for politicians, honestly, to take their role seriously. As a conservative, I believe that the foremost role of government is protecting its citizens. And I think public safety is a moral obligation. And unfortunately, too often it's been treated as a political experiment. So I think that's why I'm optimistic, is that in this moment, there's a strong urgency and a demand for change. And there's so many folks on this call and that we're all rubbing shoulders with in the halls of Congress and at the state legislatures that have the right solutions, the right answers to bring to lawmakers. Now the key will be, can we cut through the noise and ensure that they follow through?
Tim.
Thanks, Kevin. There's, I guess on the personal level, years ago, so I was actually a missionary in the early 2000s and spent time in other parts of the world, and wound up in some of those experiences finding myself in some close quarters behind interacting with law enforcement and judicial authorities, and that was in my early 20s, was kind of some of my first personal experiences of realizing that everybody that might be in a system may not necessarily have been rightly placed in that system. And so thankfully those issues were able to be resolved, but returned back to the States, went to grad school, law school, worked in the Texas legislature, and Mark Levin and I actually worked a good bit in the late 2000s and early 2010s on a lot of the reforms that Governor Perry did. And that'll get me to my first reason for some optimism. As a lot of people probably know by now, the motives or the impetus for a lot of those Texas reforms weren't necessarily altruism unto itself. It was austerity, and basically remember a meeting with the Governor Perry's team years ago. He said, "I'm not telling nursing homes and emergency rooms and elementary schools to cut, and not telling law enforcement." And so, as we're kind of find ourselves in a similar economic and fiscal situation, those are realities in a lot of states. Federal system can, if they're running low on dollars, they can just make some new ones. But the state systems don't have that luxury, and so whenever they're working on a budget, this is one of the first places that they tend to look. They're not looking to just cut willy nilly, but if they can find efficiencies, they're looking for them, and that's kind of gets a little bit to my second piece that brings me into this stuff is not necessarily initially coming from either a pro law enforcement or a pro defendant perspective, but really looking to try to restore trust in this institution, which I think Brianna said it well. This is one of the core functions of government, and if we don't get this right, not only is the safety certainly suffer, but honestly, the entire system, the entire kind of ethic and fabric that makes America America starts to dwindle. And so we're very committed. I'm the president and CEO of a group called Unify.us, and that's a lot of what we work on. Is we're trying to find solutions to real world problems and to restore trust in systems that we think are eroding too much and too quickly right now.
Thanks for that. And Vikrat.
Yeah, I work at a large foundation called Stand Together. The way that I and that the leadership of the foundation process the whole world is through a kind of philosophical framework you might call classical liberalism. Or if you're less pretentious, you might just call it libertarianism. It's more or less the same thing. And, it's a framework that basically says, if you try to maximize the individual liberty of people, you're going to have a better society. It's going to be a more prosperous society. It'll be a safer society. It'll be successful in a variety of ways. I don't think it's such an unusual point of view. I think a lot of people on this call have that point of view. I've met a lot of the membership of NACDL. I think they tend to have that point of view. I think most of the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution have that point of view. So, that's the way I think about almost everything that I read about in the news. It's also the way I think about criminal justice, but it's a little complicated at criminal justice, right? Because you can't just say, well, let people have liberty and do what they want. It's a little more complicated than that in this area. And it's a really interesting area to think about and to work in, because you really have to sort of figure out, all right, how do you make a punishment proportionate? And how do you help a person who is in the criminal justice system get out of it and become productive again so that they can realize their liberty in a productive way rather than in a counterproductive way? There are all these really interesting challenges that the people on this call have been working on for years. That's basically, I would say, what brings me to this issue. And if you want to ask me about my level of optimism, I guess I would say this. I'm a little pessimistic in the short term because that kind of philosophy is not at a high point right now. There's a lot of people in this country from both political parties who are skeptical of it. And I think that people who are believers have a lot of work to do in the short run to make sure that it stays strong and robust in American society. I'm an optimist in the long term because I think that this basic way of looking at the world is in America's DNA. I think it's really, really hard to pull it out. And I think it's going to reassert itself. I just don't know how long that's going to take. And I think if we work really, really hard, maybe it comes roaring back in 3 years. If we're lazy and we don't work hard enough, maybe it takes 30 years. I think it's coming back. So I'm an optimist in the long term, but a bit of a pessimist in the short term.
I appreciate that. And I think some of the pessimism, this is a convening of state criminal justice network. And I think a place to be optimistic is, or more optimistic, is at the state level. The federal level, it's hard to pass legislation. And then in any era, and in this moment, we're seeing sort of a pushback. And, I don't need to tell people we've got troops in the street, and we're looking at some things happen at the Justice Department that we haven't seen in a while. But if you want to make change happen and you do care, and as Tim said, I mean, states have to balance their budgets. And so the state lawmakers have, in my view, been more practical. And Mark, I want to pick up on something you said and talk about where are the areas, right? It's like not everything, it's not the moment for everything at every time. Things have their moment where this is the time. And there was a time where bail reform was big. There's been a time where sentencing reform was big. Right now, what would you say are the areas where both sides could work together to make progress?
I'll say, first of all, the bail reform, which we also had a question come in on. One of the best ways to tackle that is to reduce the number of people that show up at jail to begin with. So I was just talking to the head of the National Deflection Institute, and he told me in all the jurisdictions they're working in, they've had no difference in support in terms of whether it's a conservative sheriff or a liberal sheriff, and other officials, because obviously there's been this huge attack on quote cashless bail, but individuals experiencing a mental health crisis or an overdose, they're redirecting them when the police do that, or even through other programs from the jail to begin with, whether it's to a crisis center, wherever it might be, something more medical, that there's not opposition to that. But if that person had been taken to jail, then you'd have the whole controversy of, release with or without financial conditions. So I really thought that was notable. And of course, as I said, the back end of the system in terms of improving prison conditions, we've seen a lot of momentum in conservative states. North Dakota, for example, has made great strides, and you're not going to exactly replicate Norway, and that's not the goal. But it's to have things that doesn't cost any money to just address someone by their first name and not have everybody necessarily in orange jumpsuits. Have a sense of procedural justice. I visited a prison in Brazil that costs far less to operate than the U.S. and they had tremendous camaraderie in terms of, so there's minor disciplinary violations, the other guys in the bunk come together and figure out what the sanctions should be. And it's very empowering. And then the other thing I would say is medical and geriatric release. Many states, we've had the executive director here in Texas testify, they can't use all the top bunk beds because there's too many guys who physically can't do it. And the costs of our graying prison population are enormous. And obviously in terms of risk level, tend to be, obviously each one has to be looked at individually, but tend to be at a lower risk because of their advanced age.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would also say about prison conditions, I think today is the premiere of Alabama Solution on HBO. And so people should check that out. I think that could be one of those things, could move the culture a little bit on that issue. But I agree with you. Same thing in a lot of states, including red states. I've seen concern about how people are treated. They may want them to serve their full sentence. They may not, they may think they should be there for a while, but they don't like how people are being cared for. And that's true not just of the incarcerated people, it's for officers, because we have an officer shortage and you cannot recruit people to work in these facilities if they're in terrible shape and they don't have air conditioning and they're having to work these long hours. So I think that's one. Which brings me to a point I want to ask you, Brianna, because part of that requires on this part of advocates, not just talking about incarcerated people, but talking about how this impacts system actors like correctional officers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it may be that this is a moment where, for those of us who were working on this stuff 15 years ago, we led on public safety. And I think arguments to racial justice, economics, and some other things may not have the same appeal in this moment, but a public safety frame for everything is your best foot forward. I mean, how do you view that?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that is where the conversation is being had right now. And I don't think we should see that as a bad thing, right? Because again, everyone wants public safety. What is more unifying than that? And to your point, I think public safety has two elements, right? If you think about the continuum of the justice system, you have police on the front end who are apprehending individuals and they bring them into the courts, and you have judges who are doling out justice, right? Delivering justice. And then you have on the back end the corrections. And we focus a lot at Americans for Public Safety on policies that impact police, that impact prosecutors, law enforcement. But that's only one piece of the public safety pie. 97% of individuals who are going to be incarcerated, as your audience probably knows, are one day returning to our neighborhoods. And so what is happening while they are in correctional facilities? Are they going to come out less of a threat or more of a public safety threat? Is every bit as important. And so I do agree that correctional officers, are public safety officers as well. And their job to create environments, to create prison cultures that are productive and that are facilitating a positive internal change for the residents therein is so key. And to Mark's point, we've seen so much progress in states like North Dakota who have really done this right and really leaned in on this. And I am fairly hopeful. I know we're talking about the states, but I am fairly hopeful on a federal level because I do see some good changes happening at the BOP as well. And this really was the vision for this First Step Act, right? Is to ensure that rehabilitation is happening, and it's happening in a way that when these individuals return to our communities, there's going to be less and not more crime.
Tim, sort of picking up on both those points, but especially Mark's sort of list of things that you think are possible or more doable in this moment. Do you have anything to add or want to sort of double click on any of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there are a few different ways to kind of get at clearance rates for prosecutors' offices. The backlog across the country those are not stories that the New York Times is going to run, but are pretty profound systemic challenges, both to individual cases and victims, as well as to whole counties, the budgets of whole counties, and then it builds from there. The survivor bill, that Mark alluded to in our opening comments, there's actually 3 or 4 different states that different iterations of those have come in, providing kind of like alternative sentencing arguments that can be made for folks that may have committed a crime but were under duress or under some other conditions. The prosecutor-initiated sentencing, resentencing, are opportunities that generally those take some time and some massaging from the very beginning. I mean, by necessarily you're going to be working with prosecutors associations and individual prosecutors across the country on those. But if we're talking about durable change, I think that if you're able to kind of work your way through the morass of a process like that, it can actually lead to a system and a way of doing things that can actually last for a pretty long time. I think that workforce related issues, we kind of think a little bit. We have for the last 4 or 5 years with Unify and other places that I've been working, we've talked less about criminal justice explicitly and try to kind of like granulate our comments. And so when we're working on workforce related issues, also you're able to bring kind of Chamber of Commerce constituencies and actors into the process, which if you're talking more on kind of like social justice issues, generally corporations are going to stay a little bit more on the sideline. But if we're talking about workforce issues, it's a great way to bring large, important, less typical justice-related actors, and then I think that the last piece that I think is it's hard. This may not be legislatively, and it may not be kind of publicly facing obvious, but working on culture and kind of the recruitment retention issues that we've kind of talked around a little bit so far. Those are huge deals. And every state legislature that I'm working with readily acknowledges that we can't get enough correctional officers in the system, and nor can we keep them once we get them. And that's kind of like the blinking red light, I think, for almost every state that I'm aware of right now. And so not only working on recruitment to retention unto itself, but also maybe right sizing that there may be an element of essentially your workforce telling you something that you may not, that a lot of state legislators may be reluctant to admit. But if you can't get people law-abiding people to come and work in this system, you may have also a system problem. So I'd say that there a lot of different ways, a lot of different kind of perspectives to come at this stuff right now.
I appreciate that. Vikrant, I want to come to you and say, I agree with what everyone has been saying. And a lot of those are system changes focused on efficiency in prosecution and things like that, and in just sort of improvement of conditions when people are incarcerated and the rest. If you're working as a criminal defense lawyer, you still see a lot of the problems that we've been talking about for 15, 20 years. You see people getting sentences that don't necessarily fit the crime. You see processes that don't always seem fair. You might see discovery problems. You might see other things. So, thinking about the audience we have here, is it just a bad time to be a criminal defendant and think that there's going to be any improvements that might change their lot, or what do you see?
I'm not sure there's ever a good time to be a criminal defendant. Uh, but, I guess when it comes to uh, policy changes, it is a challenging time to sort of pass good new legislation. But on a slightly optimistic note, I don't know that it's such a terrible time to block bad legislation. And there's lots of bad legislation that's going to be proposed at the state level. And what I said in my opening about the what's kind of in the DNA of Americans. There is a lot of skepticism at a gut instinctive level of making the government very big and powerful and imposing and influential in everybody's day-to-day life, that you want to try to tap into. And you hear this actually when you are talking to legislators. Sometimes I think everybody on this call has the experience of having dealt with legislators that 10 years ago, when this work was really, really kicking, they were out making speeches about it all the time, and now they don't talk about it as much. And if you kind of buttonhole them at a conference or something and you say, so, what happened? You just not believe anymore? They all say, no, 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 I completely believe in all that stuff. I have no regrets about the votes I took 10 years ago. But we're just in a moment where if I'm talking about this stuff publicly, I have to be more careful. And what I need from you is all the right evidence and all the right stories. Stories are a big, big deal that will help me make my arguments really, really effectively. And I still want to do this work. And, I may just be in a place right now where I can't really pass good things, but I can sure block the bad things. But you've got to help by giving me all the intellectual ammunition. They say this to us over and over again. I know Brianna and Tim and Mark's been nodding his head. Brianna's been nodding her head. I know that Tim gets this too, probably more than us, because he works with legislators very directly quite a bit. They say this all the time. It's out there. There are good people who want to do good things. I don't think it's the end of the world.
Yeah, and I agree with you about the need to play defense, and it's undervalued. And I work for a philanthropy that funds, advocacy groups, and I always say, like, we cannot discount that, because a
Yes.
minor offensive win pales in comparison to a huge backslide of something important that's going to impact more people, and you just got to count both.
Calvin Coolidge, the former president, once said that it was more important to stop bad legislation than it is to pass good legislation. I think it's a great line and encapsulates a lot of how I think about the legislative process, honestly.
Yeah, and especially in this moment where the movement did make significant steps forward. And so there's going to be a natural pushback, especially since we had this spike in crime. So the answer is not to, like, we're never going to get back on offense, but just recognize the moment you're in right now.
Yeah.
Mark, I want to ask you, this was one of the questions that folks, and I know we're going to get to the questions that people had, but just in thinking about this is, there still are hard issues, though. We're seeing an attack on bail reform that is not evidence-based. It's totally driven by anecdote. We're seeing some of the worst anecdotal attack. This is Willie Horton stuff again. Juvenile justice, there was all this progress, and now we're seeing, and because people are certainly concerned, they're seeing videos. It does seem, I'm in Washington, D.C., it's 13 and 14-year-olds carjacking. It is scary stuff. So there is that fear. How do sort of progressive advocates work with conservative advocates who may be saying, look, these are my friends who are pushing this backlash? How do you stop the bleeding in a way that, like, Vikrant's talking about?
Well, first of all, I think there's important to recognize, sometimes you do need to make adjustments like New York did on their bail reform law, or in Texas, I was part of the effort to increase the property offense threshold back in 2011, where Crom was as well. And we went from $500 to $2,500 on the argument that adjusting for inflation to be a felony. Theft. And so, in the last legislative session here in Texas, that got dialed back a little bit. For example, if you have multiple thefts could be lumped together, and they've done that in California if it's part of the same spree. And also, like if you steal a coil out of an air conditioner that causes somebody, could be $10,000 in damage, but the coil itself is hardly worth anything. Those are, legitimate. Those were, things that made sense to modify that. And so I think we have to, but I'll also say that a lot of these enhancements, when they're introduced in the legislature, are terrible policy. They would affect many, many cases, but at least in Texas, typically as the process goes forward, especially once you get the fiscal note and shows how many more people this would put behind bars, you're able to, okay, let's hone in on, find out what the legislator, the type of offense they're actually interested in. And often it can be narrowed so much that it hardly affects any cases. And if you look at most of, at least in Texas, most of the ratcheting back, these bills have affect virtually nobody, because they end up, the version that passes is so specific. So, and that's a lot of the work of advocates who are on this call, obviously, helps make that possible. But it's also a matter of educating lawmakers. But typically, the bill will come from one horrible incident in their district, and they just want to nip that in the bud, but they weren't intending to put thousands more people in prison. But in terms of, I think another a broader strategy that Vakron kind of alluded to is remind folks that this is in our tradition to limit government, and policies like mandatory minimums for drugs, and civil asset forfeiture. These things started in the 70s, for example. So we got by in the United States for 200 years without these policies. And so, because obviously on the right, there's a real kind of reverence for tradition and the Constitution and so forth. And there's also, by the way, legally, a very good argument that originalism is good for criminal defendants in many cases that have gone to the Supreme Court, including last term. And really, indigent defense, the right to counsel, the right to confront your accusers. So we're on the side of the Constitution. And I think that's important to remind people of.
I want to ask Kyle, do we want to invite any questions? Do you want to share any questions from the group, or maybe I shouldn't be asking, but he's not on.
Well, so far it was touched on. The question that came in is what is causing the current wave of repeal of bipartisan bail reform.
Yeah.
So Mark talked a little bit about that, but maybe someone can expand on that.
Yeah, I want to address that because it's something that Arnold Ventures has worked a lot on. We just had Chris Christie at a convening of state lawmakers. I think this is a good example of how important, and by the way, when somebody says that we just have a messaging problem, not a policy problem, that usually just means they're losing. And sometimes you really do have a policy problem. Sometimes you're pushing for things, that really aren't fully thought through, aren't evidence-based, and you're just out of sync. And so I just think people humor themselves by saying, oh, we just got to message better. Sometimes you just got to get better policy. Bail is an example where I think if we were to have that fight, if no one had talked about it, we were having that fight today, we would be totally equipped to say, we are holding people who are no threat, too many people who are no threat. We're letting people who are a threat buy their way out. And that risk is a much better proxy for safety than wealth. And we could have that as a public safety fight. I think the issue for bail reform is when it started was at a time where the movement was doing very well and there was a huge focus on reducing mass incarceration. And so the argument for bail reform was, let's end mass incarceration, let people out of pretrial. And so even though the substance of those policy changes might be different, I think it was set up in a frame that was not that helpful. And so when people think about it, especially a lot of conservatives, they think this was just a way to empty the jails. They don't think about it as like Chris Christie and others do, that this is actually better, smarter policy. And so I do think that sometimes we dig a hole when we are not more disciplined in how we talk about this stuff. And for those of us who worked on this stuff for a long time, again, we fought on the ground of public safety. We never argued that, just over incarceration, racial justice, different issues were the thing, because we knew at the end of the day, public safety was going to be the determining factor, not just for conservatives, but for independents and most Democrats. And so I just think bail reform was caught because it hit its high point at a time where I think we were a little bit sloppy in our language. And so I think that, but I want to ask you all this because there's been questions about, as we were leading into this, about conservatives and progressives working together in this moment. It is a very polarized moment. There was a time where we were all signing letters together across organizations and saying, do this. It was really kumbaya. In this moment, even though we want to have the biggest possible team working on stuff, is that still the best approach? Do we need to do something different in this moment? And Tim, I want to bring you in on that. What have you seen change in that? Like the idea that yes, we want to coordinate, but maybe we're not doing the same things.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that to dial out a little bit, when we're talking we're talking about communication, just on almost a conceptual level, we have to kind of assess what are we communicating, but also why are we doing it? And I think there's a danger of in emotional issues like this to maybe communicate out of sort of a catharsis almost. I need to get this off my chest, and so we're just going to say it. We're going to have a rally. I'm going to give a speech. Something's wrong, and I'm going to speak up against it. And I think it's really a big deal to know your audience and to kind of basically to know your goal. Very, very refined definition of what your intent is. And so from that vantage point, rather than give kind of like a overarching prescription, I would just say you have to really be able to diagnose exactly what you're trying to accomplish, and you have to know your kind of particular jurisdiction. I work in a lot of different states. This year, I'll probably be engaged in 23 different states in some form or another, and every one of those are pretty different. And then it also depends on exactly what I'm trying to do in those states, because I might be doing quote unquote two different criminal justice kind of projects in the same state, but take a totally different approach from a comms perspective, because either a committee of jurisdiction is a little bit different, or certainly a bill is different, and kind of the constituency surrounding that coalition is different. So you really have to be able to kind of like put your thinking cap on first and go into things strategically, rather than just saying this is our MO. And let's get a bullhorn and go after this thing, because that can not only not be effective, but actually can be, and it can entrench groups and constituencies and work against you.
Brianna, do you want to follow up on that? And I'm also going to ask you, because we're 10 minutes. I knew we were going to blow through this time very easily. In addition to sort of hitting that point, which I think you could do well, any sort of thing we haven't touched that you'd want to impart, especially again, considering in the audience of people working at the state level, from the perspective they have trying to build bipartisan coalitions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. And I also wanted to briefly just touch on the question from the audience. I agree very much with what you said. If you think about the clearance rate, for example, for violent crimes, one might even say we have an under-incarceration problem for very specific crimes, right? And so I think, to the point about bail reform, I actually feel rather optimistic that bail reform is being reimagined in this moment. I don't necessarily see it as, a block to good policy moving forward. I think that people are starting to center bail decisions more in the concept of risk. And that's what's important. Not to say that money has or doesn't have a role to play, but it seems very clear that for folks who are, assessed individually to be a strong public safety threat, those folks shouldn't be let out whether or not they have $100,000 in their bank account, $1 million in their bank account. And on the flip side, it's also true for people who are not a public safety threat whatsoever. Again, that public safety risk should be the determining factor, not the amount of money that they can pay. And so I do think that the fact that you see reforms like what happened in Texas on bail. I think we're just seeing individuals leaning into this from the right in a way that before it was completely taboo. It was an area that I think was almost wholly dominated by left of center voices, the previous iteration of bail reform. And so I do believe that it's a new era of opportunity to redefine what we mean by bail reform and do it in a way that really centers public safety at the middle. And to your question about working in a bipartisan way, Tim is absolutely right. I mean, we work in West Virginia, and we got to find the policy that Republicans are going to like and they're going to pass in West Virginia to try to pull in the very small handful of delegates or senators with a D after their name, which just wouldn't make sense because they're in such a minority in that state, right? And it doesn't mean to say that we don't certainly work with other advocates that are on the left and talk to them and understand where they're coming from. But our perspective is always to lead with public safety first. What are the voices of law enforcement saying? What are voices of victims saying? And how do you make a case to lawmakers on a state-by-state basis, depending on the political makeup of those legislatures, that's going to create a path forward for that legislation? And then in terms of speaking to this audience and how they can engage, I do think it was said earlier, I think Vikrant mentioned the stories that you can bring to the table. The data is important. Stories are also important. I feel like that's another pendulum swing. Sometimes we're all about data and other times we're all about stories. Both matter, right? We really need to understand, particularly on issues where our systems, the data infrastructure still lags behind in many criminal justice systems. I was working in Ohio, and that's a perpetual challenge we hear from lawmakers is like, oh, everyone's just throwing anecdotes around. We don't even have the data to compare this. The local systems are siloed from the state systems. Okay, great. Let's tackle that challenge. Let's work on that. But in the meantime, hearing from you, individuals who are that you are representing, to highlight the challenges, what needs to be changed. And I think the more we can do that in a way that is not adversarial to the stories that prosecutors on the other side are bringing to bear, but can work in partnership, that we are collectively stakeholders in the criminal justice system to advance public safety for all Americans, I think is also going to be really important because at the end of the day, that is, and I said it before, but that is the unifying factor. So we all want to make the system better and safer for everyone who lives here.
Bertrand, what did we miss?
Well, somebody in Q&A has asked, in the name of bipartisanship, can any of the panelists name a few Republican lawmakers who strongly support bipartisanship? Said, say them by name. And I think the intent of the question maybe is to get us to concede that they're just not out there. I wouldn't concede that. I mean, we just live in such a weird time, but keep in mind that the person who at the moment is probably considered the greatest criminal justice reform villain in America, the President of the United States, is the same person who signed into law the First Step Act in 2018, right? I mean, it is a matter of finding strategic alliances. And there were senators who were big proponents of the First Step Act in 2018 who are still in the Senate. Mike Lee is still there. Senator John Cornyn is still there. And those kinds of voices are not just voices, they're votes, frankly. They're there. And I'm just naming the ones at the federal level because everybody's going to know them. But you start diving into the individual states, like West Virginia, where Brianna's doing a lot of work, like Georgia, where Tim is right now, or Texas, where Mark is right now. They are there. There are plenty of them. It's not a question of do they exist or do they not exist. It's a question of how you reach them. We have agency, all of us as advocates. It's not just that the world is either providing us opportunities or not providing us opportunities. We can make certain kinds of arguments. We can develop certain kinds of ideas. We can play the kind of back and forth that these politicians need. Well, can I have this on this end of the bill? If I'm willing to concede this on this end of the bill. This is all a part of the process. The allies are absolutely out there.
I would just want to say to that, in the moment of hope, that I watched three truth in sentencing initiatives get killed this past year in states. Kelly Armstrong led the charge as governor
Mm,
against the North Dakota measure to install truth in sentencing, and that was defeated on the floor uh, in a vote. I mean, which is as hard as you can do. A roll call vote on truth in sentencing against a Republican AG. They defeated it. Governor Stitt vetoed a truth in sentencing bill in Oklahoma, and in Missouri, they beat a truth in sentencing bill in committee, Republican legislature. So there are fewer Republicans who are championing this issue. That's 100% true.
right.
We just did a convening of 100 lawmakers. We had, it was basically evenly split. There were Republicans there who were looking for solutions and to fight back bad stuff. Not as many as there should be, not as many as I'd like, but I would not give up hope that there's folks who are good on this issue. Mark, anything that we missed because we're closing out here?
Well, and the Future Caucus, a great group of bipartisan lawmakers that has a criminal justice section of members of both parties that have united around criminal justice reform. So yeah, I think that there's nobody's certainly said it's easy, but and then the research end is important too, that we able to establish that what we're suggesting, the recommendations are effective and show where they've worked. You look now in Illinois, there hasn't been much change in the jail population since bail reform, but a greater percentage are violent, serious, high-risk individuals, which was what was intended by giving judges more authority to deny bail in those cases, while at the same time making sure low-risk individuals don't languish in jail on minor charges just because they don't have, $100 or $500.
And Tim, anything you think we missed?
Well, just super quickly, I'll say, whenever policy or legislation is hard to get at, a lot of times we can also move into implementation that sometimes lags, sometimes is almost non-existent. Ironically, one of the pieces that also is not being talked about very much is with the new director of prisons and deputy director of prisons. When they got into to the current Bureau of Prisons system, they found that there was one person, an administrative person, calculating by hand the eligibility of 155,000 potential inmates. She was calculating by hand who was eligible for First Step Act eligibility. And so you had like this very slow trickle, but in the last 2 months they've hired 5 other people. Now they have 6 people, and they're in the process of designing a computer system that actually automates this process. And so there actually are it looks like probably 3,000 to 5,000 more people in the federal system that are eligible for First Step, but the one administrator just hadn't gotten to the administration of it yet. And so I would just encourage, if kind of like the winds are pretty strong, kind of above ground, that can be a time to go below ground, so to speak, and really get into some of the nitty gritty.
Thanks for that. So we're at time. I just want to close by saying all of us panelists who had a chance to talk beforehand definitely recognize the moment that we're in. I definitely think that even as I say that I think the climate is better at the state level, there's no question that the rhetoric coming out of DC and some of the actions are going to influence what happens downstream, and especially we're heading into a contentious midterm election year. So definitely not the prime time. This is not 2014, where we were able to basically propose and pass reforms. But I think, as Vikrant said, you have to choose your battles. And some of that means focusing at the state level, focusing on issues you can win. And then the other thing is not focusing always on legislation. There's other ways to get things done through administrative changes, court rules, other ways to make policy besides up or down votes in a political body that is in a tough political climate. And so I think it's just going to require us to be better advocates and more resourceful. But I want to thank all the panelists who joined today and shared their expertise. And Kyle, I want to thank you for having us here, because I do think the movement has a good history of working across party lines. The country at this moment does not feel like bipartisanship is something that wants to be embraced, but I think we all hold that hope that outside of the bright lights and the spotlight and the short viral videos, that people really do want to get solutions to these problems. And criminal justice is one of those things that is, uh, you want to reduce the number. Everybody wants help. We want to reduce the number of crimes. We want to reduce the number of victims, and we want to reduce the harm that anybody who's in touch with the criminal justice system experiences. And so, I think this is an issue where the country, the circle of compassion, is growing to include people who are defendants and incarcerated. Um, we need that to grow more. We need that evolution to happen faster, but we're just going to have to do it in an incremental basis, especially in a time like this. But thanks for inviting this conversation.